I was standing at my grill on a warm Saturday afternoon, the smell of burgers hanging in the air, smoke drifting lazily upward. My kids were tearing across the yard with water guns, shrieking with laughter. My wife was on the patio, smiling in that relaxed way she only does when life finally feels calm. This was exactly why we moved here. Quiet street, family neighborhood. Normal. Then the sirens cut through it. 2 police cars rolled up slow, lights flashing just enough to make sure every neighbor peeked through their blinds. My kids stopped running mid-step. My wife's smile vanished. One of the officers asked if we were the source of a disturbance. A disturbance. From kids laughing and a radio you couldn't even hear past the fence. That's when I saw her. Across the street, standing perfectly still, arms crossed, mouth pressed tight in satisfaction. Linda Carlisle, HOA board member. The same woman who always had something to say about our kind of gatherings. She watched like this was the outcome she'd been waiting for. What Linda didn't know was that I wasn't just some homeowner she could intimidate with fake complaints and public embarrassment. She didn't know who I worked for. And she definitely didn't know who her own husband reported to. The moment she decided to use the police against my family, she started something she couldn't undo. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? To understand how it got this bad, you have to go back to why we chose Pine Hollow Estates in the first place. It was a quiet development tucked just outside a small town called Brookside Ridge, the kind of place where evenings were slow and people waved instead of stared. We moved there for one reason and one reason only: peace. My wife, Marisol, worked exhausting shifts as a pediatric nurse, the kind that drain you emotionally before you even step through the front door. I wanted her coming home to calm, not chaos. I wanted our kids, Lucas and Emma, riding bikes without me constantly looking over my shoulder. At first, it seemed perfect. The houses were well kept, the streets were clean, and the HOA rules were basic enough that no one paid much attention to them. Keep your lawn trimmed. Don't leave broken cars in the driveway. Common sense stuff. Nothing that felt invasive. Nothing that felt personal. Then Linda Carlisle introduced herself. She didn't knock with cookies. She didn't smile and welcome us to the neighborhood. She stood at the edge of our driveway with a clipboard tucked under her arm and eyes that scanned our house like she was assessing damage. She asked how long we planned to live there, what hours we worked, and how often we hosted gatherings. It felt less like a greeting and more like an interview I hadn't agreed to attend. From that first interaction, something felt off. Within the first week, the notices started. Our trash cans were allegedly too visible, even though they were exactly where everyone else kept theirs. Our music was labeled borderline disruptive, despite the fact that it was never loud enough to hear beyond our fence. Linda never confronted us directly. She didn't ring the bell or speak face to face. She documented, took photos, filed reports, and every time I saw her afterward, she smiled like she knew something we didn't. At first, I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. Some people take HOA duties too seriously. I told myself it would pass once she realized we weren't trouble. Marisol tried to stay optimistic too, even when she started feeling uncomfortable being watched every time she stepped into the yard. The BBQ incident wasn't random, it was escalation. By the time the police showed up, it was clear that Linda had been building towards something. The officers left embarrassed, even apologetic, quietly admitting there was nothing wrong. But embarrassment doesn't erase damage, neighbors whispered behind curtains. People who used to wave suddenly avoided eye contact. Lucas asked me why the police thought we were bad. Emma asked if we were in trouble. Marisol tried to laugh it off later that night, but I could see how deeply it hit her. There's a special kind of humiliation that comes from being publicly questioned in front of your kids, especially when you've done nothing wrong. She worried about what people thought. She worried about rumors. She worried about being labeled as that family. 2 days later, the HOA letter arrived. Certified mail. Formal language. Formal language. Heavy paper designed to intimidate. Noise violations. Unauthorized gathering. A fine with daily penalties attached. It read like a verdict, not a notice. There were no dates listed. No times. No evidence. No decibel readings. Just vague claims and absolute authority. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. I went back through the document line by line, and that's when it clicked. This wasn't about enforcing rules. This wasn't about maintaining neighborhood standards. This was about power. About reminding us that someone else believed they had control over our home, our family, and our sense of belonging. I started noticing things I'd overlooked before. Other houses hosted parties louder than ours. Other kids played later into the evening. Other driveways were cluttered. None of them received letters. None of them had police show up. Linda didn't apply the rules evenly. She applied them selectively, and once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. The HOA wasn't a neutral organization. It was a tool. And Linda was wielding it with precision, smiling the entire time. She didn't need to yell or threaten. She let paperwork and flashing lights do the work for her. That was the moment I understood something important. This wasn't going to stop on its own. After the fine came the inspections, and that's when the pressure stopped feeling subtle. Linda started walking past our house every single day, sometimes twice, always slow. Always with her phone in her hand. She never pointed it directly, but the angle was obvious enough to feel like a threat. It wasn't about taking pictures anymore. It was about letting us know she could. Suddenly, everything was a problem. The small flag Marisol hung near the porch was suddenly labeled improper placement. The kids' chalk drawings on the sidewalk, the same ones other children up and down the street made, were written up as defacement of common areas. Even my grill, which hadn't moved since the day we bought it, was flagged as a potential fire risk, despite meeting every safety requirement. It felt endless, like she was flipping through a rule book looking for anything she could twist. I tried reason first because that's what normal people do. I sent an email to the HOA board. I kept it calm, polite, professional, no accusations, no emotion. I laid out the facts, asked for clarification, and requested evidence for the violations. Days passed, no response. I followed up, still nothing. The silence was louder than any reply could have been. It told me everything I needed to know. The board wasn't interested in fairness. They weren't interested in facts. They were backing Linda, whether they admitted it or not. Marisol started changing in ways that scared me more than the fines. She became quieter, more tense. She started asking me questions late at night about whether this could affect her job, whether someone could file a complaint against her license, whether hospitals talk to HOAs. I reassured her, but I could hear the fear underneath her words. Rumors can ruin careers long before the truth ever gets a chance. Our kids felt it too. Lucas stopped asking if friends could come over. Emma erased her chalk drawings the moment she finished them, like she was afraid they'd get us in trouble. Childhood shouldn't feel like walking on eggshells, but that's exactly what our home had become. And then the police came again. This time it wasn't for noise. It was a call for a domestic disturbance. When the officer stepped out of the car, his body language said everything. He wasn't cautious. He wasn't alert. He looked tired, annoyed even. He walked up, asked a few basic questions, and glanced around the house like he already knew what he wasn't going to find. While his partner spoke with Marisol, he leaned in and lowered his voice. "Someone keeps calling things in on you," he said quietly, not accusatory. Informational. I asked if we were doing anything wrong. He shook his head. "No. But we have to respond when calls come in." That was the moment the pit settled in my stomach, because now it wasn't just HOA letters. It wasn't just fines. It was official records, police logs, a paper trail that could be twisted by anyone who wanted to paint a picture that didn't exist. The officers left quickly, apologetic again. But apologies don't erase patterns. That night, Marisol barely ate dinner. She sat at the table staring at nothing, twisting her napkin in her hands. She asked me what happens if the police keep showing up. What if someone believes it? What if someone at her hospital hears about it and assumes the worst? I didn't have easy answers. I tucked the kids into bed and sat in the dark living room long after the house went quiet. That's when I stopped telling myself this would blow over. That's when I stopped hoping Linda would get bored or move on to someone else. Because people who abuse systems don't stop when they get what they want. They stop when they're made to. And Linda wasn't looking for compliance anymore. She was testing how far she could push without consequences. She was learning that paperwork and phone calls could do damage without ever raising her voice. She was seeing how fear works when it's drip-fed into a family's life, one notice, one visit, one rumor at a time. I started keeping records, dates, times, copies of letters, screenshots of emails, names of officers, case numbers. Not because I planned to fight yet, but because something in me knew this was no longer a neighborhood disagreement. This was escalation disguised as procedure, and the most dangerous thing about it was how ordinary it looked from the outside. A complaint here, a report there. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would raise alarms on its own. But stacked together, it told a very clear story. And I had a feeling Linda was about to make a mistake big enough that even she wouldn't be able to explain it away. I attended my first HOA meeting expecting resistance, but not the atmosphere I walked into. The room felt less like a neighborhood gathering and more like a courtroom where the verdicts had already been decided. Linda sat at the head of the table, papers neatly stacked, posture stiff, eyes sharp. She didn't welcome discussion. She controlled it. Every time a neighbor tried to speak, she cut them off. Questions were labeled off-topic. Concerns were brushed aside as misunderstandings. When someone pushed back, she used the same phrase every time, delivered with a practiced smile, "Let's keep this civil." What she really meant was quiet. When my turn came, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse her of targeting my family. I simply asked about procedure. I asked how violations were documented. I asked who reviewed them. I asked how votes were recorded before fines were issued. Linda leaned back in her chair and sighed, loud enough for the room to hear. She said my tone was aggressive. She said I was making people uncomfortable. She suggested we move on. That's when I realized arguing emotionally was exactly what she wanted. Emotion could be dismissed. Emotion could be framed as hostility. Facts were harder to silence. So I changed tactics. I asked where the evidence was for my violations. Not opinions, not assumptions. Evidence, photographs with timestamps, noise readings, witness statements. I asked where the board votes were recorded, who approved the fines, when the meetings were held, where the minutes were posted. The room went quiet. Linda shuffled her papers. She said documentation wasn't always required. She said the board had discretion. She said she didn't have everything with her. That was all it took. I watched the shift happen in real time. A woman 2 rows over frowned and whispered something to her husband. Another man raised his hand and said he'd been fined for trash placement without photos. Someone else said their notice didn't list a date either. One by one, people started realizing their experiences weren't isolated. The fines weren't random. They were vague on purpose. Linda tried to regain control. She said these discussions were unproductive. She said the meeting was running long. She announced an early adjournment, but it was too late. Doubt had entered the room, and once doubt shows up, authority starts to crack. People weren't angry yet. They were curious, And curiosity is dangerous when someone's power depends on blind acceptance. As people stood up and gathered their things, several neighbors stopped me quietly. They thanked me for speaking up. They told me they'd felt singled out but didn't know how to say it without making things worse. One older man admitted he'd paid every fine just to avoid attention. That was when it hit me. Linda didn't need everyone's cooperation. She just needed their fear. I left the meeting calm on the outside, but my mind was racing. The pattern was clearer now: selective enforcement. Vague paperwork, intimidation dressed up as governance. And behind it all, a board that either didn't know what she was doing or didn't want to know. When I got home, Marisol asked how it went. I told her the truth, that things had shifted, but not in a way that would stop Linda. Not yet. People like her don't back down when questioned. They double down. That night, I sat at my desk, long after the house was quiet. I spread out the letters, the emails, the police incident numbers. I compared dates. I noticed something I'd missed before. The timing of the complaints was oddly consistent. Certain reports lined up too neatly with specific workdays, specific hours. That's when a thought crossed my mind that I'd been avoiding. Linda's husband. I knew his name, of course. I'd seen him a handful of times. Quiet, polite. Always seemed uncomfortable when Linda was talking. I knew he worked for the federal government, but I hadn't cared enough to look deeper. He wasn't the one harassing us. Linda was. But systems don't exist in isolation. I pulled up my internal directory and typed his name in, more out of curiosity than suspicion. When his profile loaded, my chest tightened. Same department. Same division. Not just connected. Directly connected. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Suddenly, things that hadn't made sense before started snapping into place. The confidence. The boldness. The way Linda never seemed worried about consequences. The way she used official channels without hesitation. I wasn't ready to act on it yet. I didn't tell Marisol. I didn't tell anyone. I simply saved the file and closed my laptop. But as I sat there in the dark, one thing became painfully clear. This wasn't just an HOA abusing power. This was someone who believed they were untouchable. And people who think that always push too far. Her husband's name was Mark Carlisle. Federal employee, analyst, FBI. Seeing it laid out that plainly made my stomach tighten, not with fear, but with something colder. Calculation. Because this wasn't just a bad neighbor married to a government worker. This was a conflict of interest sitting right in my living room, staring back at me from a screen. And the part Linda never bothered to learn was that I wasn't just in federal law enforcement. I supervised Mark, not in a dramatic, movie-style way. No shouting matches. No secret vendettas. Just a quiet, professional chain of command. I reviewed his performance. I signed off on his assignments. I had a legal obligation to evaluate risk, integrity, and disclosure. And suddenly, the behavior happening in his household wasn't just personal anymore. It was relevant. But I didn't rush. I didn't confront him. I didn't say a word to anyone. I documented. Every HOA notice went into a folder. Every fine, every vague accusation, every missing timestamp. I pulled public police logs and matched them to the dates Linda had filed complaints. I noted which officers responded and how quickly the calls were cleared. I saved emails I'd sent to the board and the silence that followed. I wrote down the names of neighbors who had quietly told me they'd been targeted too. Patterns started forming. Calls always came in during the same windows. Complaints clustered around specific days. The escalation followed a rhythm, like someone testing boundaries and adjusting based on response. This wasn't chaos. It was methodical. Marisol knew I was stressed, but I didn't tell her why. She already carried enough worry on her shoulders. Her job demanded focus, compassion, and emotional control. She couldn't afford distractions, and I refused to let Linda steal more from us than she already had. Then something happened that erased any doubt about Linda's intentions. Marisol came home from work one evening quieter than usual. She set her bag down slowly and sat at the kitchen table without saying a word. When I asked what was wrong, she hesitated, like she wasn't sure she should even tell me. Someone had called her hospital, not a patient, not a coworker, someone anonymous. They didn't accuse her of anything outright. They didn't have to. They mentioned unsafe conditions at her home. They suggested concerns about children, about stress, about environment. Just enough language to trigger protocol. Just enough to force her supervisor to initiate an internal review. No details, no evidence, just implication. That was the moment the situation changed permanently. HOA fines are annoying. Police visits are humiliating. But this was different. This was an attempt to undermine Marisol's career using fear and suggestion. It was designed to make her doubt herself, to make her feel watched even at work, to poison the professional space she'd worked years to earn. She sat there gripping her hands together, asking me what if this followed her? What if someone believed it? What if it affected her license? I could see the panic she was trying to keep under control, the same way she keeps calm around frightened parents at the hospital. I felt something harden in my chest. This was no longer HOA nonsense. This was no longer neighborhood drama. This was intentional harm, and it was criminal. I reassured Marisol as best I could, told her reviews like this happened, that she'd done nothing wrong, that it would pass. But inside, I was done pretending this could be solved by patience. Linda had moved from intimidation to sabotage, from control to destruction. That night, after the kids were asleep, I went back to my records. I added a new section, workplace interference. I noted the timing of the call, cross-referenced it with Linda's activity. It lined up perfectly with a day she'd been particularly aggressive, particularly bold. Then I looked at Mark again. Federal employees are required to disclose certain risks, legal issues in the household, patterns of behavior that could compromise judgment or access. If Linda was using official systems to harass families, and Mark knew or assisted, that wasn't just unethical. It was dangerous. I didn't assume his guilt. I didn't need to. The system doesn't work on assumptions. It works on facts, and facts were piling up fast. I thought about all the times Linda had acted so confident, so untouchable. The way she weaponized authority without hesitation, the way she never seemed worried about consequences. People don't act like that unless they believe someone will protect them. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark, listening to the house settle. The same house Linda had tried to turn into a problem. The same family she'd tried to isolate and weaken piece by piece. She thought she was applying pressure. What she didn't realize was that pressure creates records. And records, when handled correctly, don't just tell a story, they end one. After that, things moved quickly. Too quickly to be coincidence. Linda filed another emergency complaint, this time during a small neighborhood block gathering that wasn't even ours. A few families had set up folding tables at the end of the cul-de-sac. Kids were riding bikes in circles. Someone had brought a portable speaker, barely louder than conversation. It was the kind of harmless get-together HOAs usually brag about in newsletters. Within minutes, the fire department arrived. Lights, trucks, neighbors standing in the street, confused and uneasy. The call claimed there was a hazardous chemical smell coming from our direction. Possible exposure, possible danger. A hazmat concern. It was dramatic language designed to force a response, even if there was nothing behind it. There was nothing behind it. The firefighters walked through, checked the area, and found absolutely nothing. No chemicals, no leaks, no risks. One of them shook his head and muttered something about another one. Another quietly asked if we'd had issues with false reports before. That's when I knew this wasn't happening in a vacuum anymore. By now, multiple agencies were seeing the pattern. Police, fire, dispatchers, the same address, the same caller behavior, the same outcomes. Clear calls that ended in nothing but confusion and wasted resources. Linda wasn't just harassing us. She was abusing emergency systems. I didn't confront her. I didn't warn her. People like Linda see warnings as challenges. Instead, I shifted focus. I stopped reacting and started setting conditions. I decided to organize a community, BBQ, not a spontaneous one. Not something she could frame as unauthorized. I did it openly. I checked the HOA rules line by line. I looked at city permits. I made sure every detail was covered. Date, time, noise limits, fire safety, everything. If Linda wanted paperwork, I was going to give her more paperwork than she could choke on. I invited neighbors who'd been fined, neighbors who'd been watched, neighbors who'd quietly apologized to us for not wanting trouble. I told them it wasn't about protesting or causing drama. It was about being visible together, about existing without fear. Something interesting happened when I sent those invites. People said yes. Not immediately, not enthusiastically at first. But they said yes, one by one. Some hesitated, asking if it would make things worse. Others admitted they'd been waiting for someone to push back. A few shared their own stories quietly, stories that sounded eerily familiar. Vague notices, selective enforcement, fear of retaliation. I also invited witnesses, not just neighbors, but people whose presence mattered. People who understood process. People who knew how patterns are evaluated. I didn't tell everyone why. I didn't need to. The fewer details circulating, the better. And then I invited people Linda didn't expect. I reached out to contacts I trusted, individuals who could observe without interfering, people who would notice how authority was used, people who would remember what they saw. I didn't frame it as a trap. I framed it as transparency, because when someone relies on intimidation, the last thing they want is an audience. Marisol was nervous when I told her the plan. She worried it would provoke Linda even more. She worried about another call, another scene. I told her the truth, that I expected Linda to react, that I expected her to overreact, and that this time that reaction would matter. The day of the BBQ arrived, and the mood was different from the first one. Still warm, still friendly, but layered with something else. Awareness. People lingered instead of rushing home. Conversations happened in clusters. Parents watched their kids and watched the street at the same time. I noticed Linda almost immediately. She stood across the way, phone in hand, pretending to check messages while angling the camera toward us. She paced, stopped, whispered into her phone. Her posture was rigid, like someone trying to contain irritation behind a smile. She was deciding what to do. I knew her pattern by now. When she felt ignored, she escalated. When she felt challenged, she sought authority. When she felt exposed, she went for something dramatic. So I waited. I flipped burgers. I laughed with neighbors. I made sure everything looked exactly like what it was, a normal community gathering. No shouting, no arguments, no violations, just families existing in the open. And when Linda finally made her move, it wasn't subtle, but this time it didn't land the way she expected. Because the difference between intimidation and accountability is witnesses. And this time she had plenty. Linda didn't ease into it. She stormed straight into the middle of the gathering like she owned the street, a stack of HOA papers clenched in her hand, voice already raised before anyone even spoke to her. She started shouting about violations, unauthorized use of common areas, safety concerns, noise limits. Her words tumbled over each other, loud and frantic, designed to dominate the moment and force people into silence. Everyone stopped. Kids froze mid-game. Conversations died off. Neighbors turned to look, some startled, others unsurprised. Linda pointed at tables, at the grill, at people standing on the sidewalk, demanding the whole thing be shut down immediately. She kept saying she had authority, that she'd already documented everything, that consequences were coming. And then Mark arrived. He came fast, walking with purpose but wearing a look I'd never seen on him before. Panic, real panic, real panic. He glanced at the crowd, at the police car parked down the street, at the fire truck still idling nearby from the earlier call. Then he went straight to Linda and grabbed her arm, whispering urgently. She yanked it away. She told him not to tell her what to do. She told him she was handling it. Her voice cracked as she spoke, frustration spilling into something uglier. She accused the neighbors of disrespect. She accused me of provoking her. She said people like us were always trying to bend the rules. That was when I stepped forward. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't interrupt her rant. I waited until she paused just long enough to take a breath. Then I spoke. I said her name calmly and told her I needed everyone's attention for just a moment. The crowd turned toward me, confused but quiet. Linda scoffed, clearly expecting me to argue or plead. I didn't. I introduced myself properly. Not as her neighbor, as Mark's supervisor. The effect was instant. Mark's face drained of color. He froze where he stood, eyes locked on me like he'd just realized the floor beneath him wasn't solid anymore. Linda laughed once, sharp and dismissive, like she thought it was a joke. It wasn't. I explained, slowly and clearly, that I was responsible for reviewing Mark's performance, his disclosures, and his suitability for continued federal work. I explained that I had an obligation to evaluate risk, including risks originating in a household. I didn't accuse. I didn't threaten. I stated facts. The silence was heavy. I then laid out what I had documented. False police reports, repeated emergency calls cleared without findings, a hazmat complaint with no hazard, workplace interference directed at my wife, HOA fines issued without evidence, timestamps or proper votes, all of it logged, all of it dated, all of it forming a pattern. I didn't do it dramatically. I didn't wave papers or raise my voice. I spoke like someone explaining a file. The officers nearby started paying closer attention. One of them shifted his stance, arms crossing as he listened. A firefighter stepped closer. A few neighbors murmured quietly, recognition dawning on their faces. Linda tried to interrupt. She shouted that I was lying, that I was abusing my position, that this was harassment against her. But the more she spoke, the worse it got. Her voice grew shrill. She started contradicting herself. She accused the police of not doing their jobs. She accused the fire department of ignoring danger. She accused neighbors of plotting against her. At one point, she screamed that people like us didn't belong there in the first place. That's when everything tipped. The officer closest to her asked her to calm down. She snapped back at him. The firefighter asked about the chemical complaint. She dodged the question. Someone asked why she'd called Marisol's hospital. She denied it too quickly. Mark tried again to pull her away, his voice shaking now. He told her to stop. He told her she was making it worse. She rounded on him, yelling that he was supposed to protect her, that this was his fault for not handling it. That outburst did more damage than anything I could have said, because now everyone could see it. Not just the paperwork, not just the pattern. The mindset, the entitlement, the belief that systems existed for her use, not for fairness. Law enforcement didn't rush to arrest her. That's not how real life works, but they did something more important. They started asking questions, detailed questions. And Linda, overwhelmed and exposed, couldn't stop talking. By the time she realized what she'd done, it was already too late. Her own words were unraveling her authority in front of witnesses, neighbors, and officials who were now seeing the full picture. She thought power came from yelling the loudest. What she learned instead was that meltdowns don't intimidate when everyone is watching. They confirm everything. What followed wasn't dramatic in the way people imagine from television. There were no instant arrests, no shouting, no handcuffs snapped on in front of the neighborhood. What happened instead was slower, quieter, and far more devastating for the people who had relied on the system to protect them. Within days, questions turned into processes. The fire department filed formal notes about repeated emergency calls that resulted in no findings. Police reports were reviewed side by side, showing a clear pattern of complaints tied to the same caller and the same address. What had once looked like isolated incidents now read like a coordinated effort to harass under the cover of public safety. Mark was placed on administrative leave pending an internal review. It wasn't framed as punishment. It never is at first. It was framed as procedure, a review of disclosures, a review of judgment, a review of whether household behavior posed a risk to professional responsibility. He didn't argue it. He couldn't. The paper trail was too clean, the timing too precise. Silence, in his case, was the only option left. Linda's situation unraveled even faster. False reporting is treated very differently once it's documented as a pattern. Harassment becomes something else entirely when it crosses into interference with employment and misuse of emergency services. She was contacted formally, then interviewed, then warned. And when she didn't stop talking, when she kept insisting everyone else was the problem, the tone changed. Charges followed. Not dramatic ones, but real ones. False reporting. Harassment. Abuse of process. Enough to force her to hire an attorney and stop pretending this was a neighborhood disagreement. The HOA board didn't survive the scrutiny. Once residents realized how loosely rules had been applied, they started asking for records, votes, minutes, approval logs. Things that were supposed to exist but didn't. The board members who had stayed quiet suddenly became very uncomfortable. Some resigned quickly. Others tried to distance themselves from Linda, claiming they hadn't known the extent of her actions. That didn't work. An emergency election was called. Policies were rewritten with oversight requirements. Documentation standards were implemented. Anonymous complaints were restricted. It wasn't revenge. It was correction. The kind that only happens after damage has already been done. Neighbors started approaching us in ways they hadn't before. Some apologized outright. Others did it awkwardly, avoiding eye contact while admitting they should have spoken up sooner. A few confessed they'd paid fines they knew were unfair just to avoid attention. I didn't hold it against them. Fear makes people quiet. Linda had relied on that. Marisol's hospital review ended the way it should have from the beginning. No findings, no concerns. No follow-up. Her supervisor pulled her aside and apologized for the stress, explaining that the call had raised red flags almost immediately. It had been vague, unsourced, suspicious. Knowing that didn't erase the anxiety she'd carried, but it gave her back something important. Her confidence. Our house changed after that. Not physically, emotionally. The kids stopped asking if the police were coming back. Lucas invited friends over again. Emma left her chalk drawings on the sidewalk without rushing to erase them. Laughter returned to the yard in a way that felt unforced, natural, like it used to be. And Linda? She didn't wave anymore. Didn't walk the street with her phone angled just right. She kept her head down. Avoided eye contact. The power she once wielded so casually was gone, not because someone took it from her, but because it had never truly belonged to her in the first place. The most striking change was the silence. No letters. No notices. No cars slowing in front of our house. No flashing lights. Control had shifted, not dramatically, but definitively. The system Linda tried to manipulate did what it always does when given enough light and enough documentation. It corrected itself. Slowly, methodically, without emotion. And for the first time since moving to Pine Hollow Estates, our home felt like ours again. Linda thought authority was something you could put on like a costume, a clipboard, a few phone calls, some official-sounding language, and enough confidence to scare people into silence. For a long time, that worked for her. People backed down, paid fines, stayed quiet, let her believe she was untouchable. What she didn't understand was that real systems don't run on volume or intimidation. They run on records, on timelines, on patterns that don't care who's shouting the loudest. What stayed with me wasn't the satisfaction of seeing her lose control. It wasn't revenge. It was the exact moment her power vanished, not because I raised my voice, but because the truth was finally spoken out loud in front of people who mattered. Once that happened, there was no way for her to put it back together. I learned something through all of this. Bullies who hide behind rules rely on one thing above all else: isolation. They want you to feel alone, embarrassed, unsure of yourself. The moment you document, the moment you slow down and stop reacting emotionally, the moment you let patterns speak for themselves, everything changes. You don't have to yell louder than someone like that. You don't have to threaten or fight dirty. You just have to stay steady long enough for the system to see what's really happening. Because once it does, the person abusing it usually collapses under their own weight. Our home feels peaceful again. Our kids laugh without hesitation. My wife walks through the front door without that tension in her shoulders. And that, more than anything, feels like winning. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?